Next up will be Kevon Martis from Interstate Informed Citizens Coalition. Is that correct? Yes, sir.
Well, thanks so much. It's a privilege to be with you tonight, and thanks, Tom, for doing a fine job as always. I got my start in the energy policy and land use issues about 2008, 2009. I was a local planning commissioner in southeast Michigan, in Riga, about 20 minutes outside of Toledo, Ohio, so we live very nearby. And like Tom, I've been involved in this ever since, having had a front row seat of how wind developers treat local communities. It started to bug me a little bit, and I followed a similar path as Tom, and learned a number of things that I hope will be of value to you tonight. The first line probably won't do me much good here in Ohio, but I do have a degree from the University of Michigan, and I will be embarrassed to see the outcome of the game in November, I'm sure. I've worked on wind energy zoning for a long time now. One of the ordinances we created in my own township later became a state model for wind energy zoning. We do have local control still in Michigan of wind energy projects, so one utility is now starting to push to take local control away. I don't think they'll be successful. And I am not a lawyer, but I do watch Law and Order. And here's the state model ordinance that we helped adopt. Now there's a range of restrictions in those ordinances. Some are very permissive and friendly to wind development, others are quite conservative. And I could say, I would love to say that this is the first time I've been in a meeting room like this, but sadly the most reliable thing about wind energy is the division it creates in the host communities. So I'm glad to be here, but yet I'm sad that we have to be here to have this discussion yet again. The good news is, I believe that reasonable wind energy zoning regulations driven by the principles of consent and compensation can place the burden of deciding whether a given community hosts utility scale wind development into the private hands of the developer and the local citizens rather than surrendering that control to a power setting board or local zoning board. This will become more clear as I talk about it. Now, Michigan has far more wind developed than Ohio, despite the fact that we have local control. And it turns out that the common denominator for why wind gets built in various communities in Michigan is called conflict of interest. They go in and lease the officials as early as possible. The worst case I know of is Fairgrove Township in Thumb. 9 out of 13 elected and appointed officials have signed wind leases. That's how you get your projects built under local control. Initially, the state had some published guidelines of 1,000 feet setbacks and 55 decibel noise limits. But experience has been a harsh teacher in Michigan. Every major wind development has had some kind of action taking place, either litigation, lots of complaints about noise, referendum, recall, etc. Just consider the case of the Garden Peninsula, which is up here. Mr. Shieldcastle talked about the birds, and we have a lot of shoreline, of course, and I worked with a lady that Mark might know named Monica Essenmacher from Port Crescent, Port Huron Hawk Watch. We have tremendous large raptor flyways through that area, like 20,000 hawks she's counted in a very short time. All that to say, Fish and Wildlife Service did tell Heritage not to build on the Garden Peninsula, and they did anyways. It was a very strongly worded letter saying we do not recommend it, and they built. Now the guy that owns Heritage Energy, you may see on television, if you've seen any of the show the last winter called The Mystery of Oak Island, that's the guy that went out and was trying to dig up the buried pirate treasure. It's a boring story, I'll leave it alone. 73 people living inside a 14-turbine cluster in the Heritage Project in the Garden Peninsula have signed this letter begging for relief. Turns out that they say the 45 decibel noise limits that the developer said would sound like a dishwasher, sound like anything but. It's the only project I know where 400-foot class turbines are closer than 1,000 feet to people's homes. It's the only place I know where they can hear them over their television. Here's the reality of our Public Act 295, which is our renewable energy mandate. This is my friends, the Schimmeldeckers. They live next to this turbine. Again, they were told that, heck, you hardly notice they're there. Their two college-age sons came home last winter, and after 2 nights in the house said, Mom and Dad, we've forgotten how bad it is. We can't stay here for spring break. Carrie and Karen sleep in their basement and take sleeping pills to go to sleep at night. That's 1,139-foot setback. They claim they would hit a 45 decibel noise limit, and in fact, they've gone beyond that, and the courts have found that Consumers Energy is not complying with the ordinance and are being ordered to mitigate. And which is curious, because I saw the newspaper article here where the local developer is saying that like 1,300 feet, they'll be able to keep it under 40 decibels. That would be the first project in the world that I know of that can hit those kinds of noise limits. In Michigan, every time the 40 decibel noise limit is adopted, the wind developer runs for cover because they said it's a 2,000 or 3,000 foot setback. I don't see any way they could hit 40 decibels at 13 or 1,400 feet, except in June, July, and August, because they don't spin very much then. The state has observed a lot of things in the last year with wind, and we were involved in this process. The governor had a series of energy roundtables all around the state. We participated in them. I was a keynote speaker at the last one. And they prepared this report called Ready Michigan to Make Good Energy Decisions. And a number of things have changed. They're now referencing documents that suggest a mile and a quarter setback for turbines and noise limits below 40 decibels in hilly terrain. And we agree with that. This is the Poplinski household. They lived in one of the first large-scale wind developments in the Thumb. They and 18 neighbors sued Noble, then John Deere, then Exelon, because it changed hands 3 times in 4 years. He rented a house in a neighboring village of Ubley where he could sleep there at night. He can check on his phone the wind direction at night. And when he sees it's coming out a certain direction, he goes and stays in the apartment. Well, now they've actually built a bunker in their basement, so they are able to stay in the house. So, the Michigan report does find credible this report that says that wind energy generation is not without adverse health impacts, which again contradicts what I saw in that newspaper ad. Setback distances from turbines need to be a mile and a quarter. This is the Heritage Project in the middle of the state. First abandoned house due to wind turbine noise in the state of Michigan is in this project. They just achieved a settlement with Heritage Energy. And we agree with this. We think the ideal design goal for wind is below 40 decibels. So that's what our state is now finding credible is with respect to impacts of renewable energy. Something else we've learned is that Michigan wind is very much non-competitive. You can see Iowa here has these purple regions. And now, despite the wind guys saying you got great wind in Michigan, we have none. Well, if you, the bottom line is every time you raise the wind speed, you get a substantial increase in the amount of energy available from every device. Michigan has a permanent 2-to-1 price disadvantage with Iowa on every turbine erected, which is why our average power purchase agreement price for renewable energy in Michigan is $76 a megawatt hour. You heard Tom say that in PJM it's only worth $35. Every time you build a turbine in Michigan, you could have produced twice as much CO2 and produced twice as much energy just by building in a different state. How is that a good value, even if you're an environmentalist who thinks wind turbines are going to save the planet? Ohio wind is no better. Arguably, it's worse than Michigan's wind. And of course, they tell you these new taller turbines fix all these problems, but if you follow the gold-colored line, that's the power purchase agreement price in states like Michigan, Ohio, and the purple ones are in Iowa, Minnesota, and North Dakota. You can see no matter how big the turbines get, that price. And we also learned Michigan's now spent $2.5 billion worth of wind and transmission. At best, I've updated this number a little bit. I know the red is hard to see, but the truth is that $2.5 billion worth of wind plus transmission, at best, assuming it did nothing but interrupt coal generation, reduced our statewide emissions by 4%. In truth, it probably interrupted a lot of gas-fired generation, and some of it may have been exported out of state. Had we built combined cycle gas turbine plants for $2.5 billion instead of wind plants, we would have cut our in-state emissions of coal about half, 25% of CO2, half of the fine particulates and mercury for the same price, and all the benefit would have been in-state for sure. It's a very poor deal environmentally. And the Brookings Institute, which is a center-left group that's very much concerned about global warming, came to the same conclusion. New hydroelectric, nuclear, gas combined cycle plants are much more beneficial for megawatt of capacity than wind or solar plants, with gas combined cycle being the most beneficial. And even James Hansen, the famous global warming alarmist, has said, suggesting that renewables will let us phase rapidly off fossil fuels is the equivalent of believing the Easter Bunny in the Tooth Fairy. This is not really a green crusade that these guys are on. Now, what about the land use issues? You heard Tom discuss this. This is the Fermi 2 reactor that Detroit Edison owns just south of Detroit, 1,100 megawatts. Let's say you really hate nuclear, like they've decided in Germany. You want to get rid of that? You could do it with wind. You can simply cover every square mile from Toledo to Detroit, almost to Ann Arbor, with 2 500-foot tall Vestas V100 turbines. And you still have to build 1,000 megawatts of gas for those pesky months of June, July, and August. So it can be done. It turns out that 30% renewables in the state of Michigan would cost about $28 billion just to build the turbines, which is enough to close almost every coal plant in the Midwest and replace it with combined cycle gas. From your perspective, a township worth of wind turbines like this can be replaced with a simple cycle gas turbine mounted on a semi-trailer that will hide inside your average dairy barn. So they're asking you to turn your township into a township-sized power plant when you could produce the same amount of energy in a barn and close the door. So, now let's look at the siting questions in particular. How do we evaluate any product? Well, we look at the total cost of ownership. We need to know the price and the value and what do we get for the money. Well, if you're going to buy a car, that's pretty simple. We all have a lot of experience with cars. We buy them, we drive them, everybody has a favorite brand, loyalty, and a type. That's easy to decide what we like in a car because we're very familiar with them. But when a wind guy shows up and says he wants to build some 2.2 megawatt Nordex units or V100s, you have to say, well, how tall is that? Well, 476 feet in the case of the V100, but that's hard to envision. But since people from Ohio appear to own about half the Upper Peninsula, most of you will be familiar with this bridge. 550 feet tall is the towers. If you've driven across that, you start to get some idea how tall they are. By the way, the latest turbines being discussed now in Michigan are 570 footers, and I'm consulting with some people in Maryland where Pioneer Green is looking to build 690-foot offshore turbines on shore. And of course, the industry does like to give you nice, wonderful pictures of what these turbines actually look like, but as I've already shown you, the reality is far different. So, health, safety, and welfare. I usually give this talk to people who have the ability to regulate wind turbines inside their own municipality. But health, safety, and welfare protection is the sworn duty of everybody that takes the oath of office, either as an appointed official or an elected official. Now, in the case of Ohio, of course, that authority has been transferred to the Ohio Power Siting Board. Nonetheless, when you read their mission statement, you'll see it's very much another way of saying health, safety, and welfare. Benefit of the Ohio citizens, promoting the state's economic interests, and protecting the environments and land use. So very much the same charge that everybody has, health, safety, and welfare. Now remember, and you will know this now, developers of any type are crafty and they present many superficially enticing arguments. But protecting health, safety, and welfare has to come first. So here's some questions when you're presented with the claims of any developer. Are the developer's profits more important than health, safety, and welfare? Are promised increases in tax revenue more important than health, safety, and welfare? Are claims of private property rights more important? Are claims of green jobs or emissions reductions more important than protecting health, safety, and welfare? And the simple answer is no. There are many impacts associated with regulating wind turbines, and we've discussed the birds a little bit tonight, some of the energy policy. I'm only going to focus on a few. Most important by far are physical setbacks and noise limits. Let me talk about those, decommissioning just briefly about property values. I'm trying to find sources here that are very credible. It'd be easy for me to go to certain websites and they say, well, he's picking all anti-wind websites. What do you expect them to say about the impacts of turbines? I say let's go to the biggest manufacturer of turbines in the world, Vestas. And they say in their instructions to their employees, if a runway operation should occur, the plant must be evacuated immediately by running upwind, and access to the surrounding area in a radius of 500 meters must be restricted. That's 1,640 feet. Nordex says the same thing. In case of a fire or on the rotor, parts may fall off the wind turbine. In case of a fire, nobody's permitted within 1,640 feet. See, there's a theme here. Turns out in real life, 1,500 feet is what happens when the rotor fails like it did in Illinois. And that's only a 390-foot class turbine. They have some idea of the safe perimeter radius here based on experience. Now, as you guys will already be aware of, what the developer typically comes in and recommends is a 1,000 or 1,300-foot setback to the home, which you can see here. Even though the manufacturer's evacuation zone extends beyond the house. So in the example of the Schindeldecker home that I showed you earlier, if that thing caught fire or the brake failed, the employees would have to run 500 feet past Mr. Schindeldecker's house to reach the evacuation zone. Now, I don't know if they would feel obligated to knock on the door on their way by. I'm not sure how that would work. Sometimes you'll see them recommend that the setback be something like 1640 to the house. But you can see, you've now lost all this property for future development rights. It's been surrendered to the neighbor's wind project because you now have that safety zone extending all the way into your property like that. And not to mention, your children's swing set might be here, and the house you wanted to build for your daughter and son-in-law might go right here, except you just surrendered that property to the neighbor or had it taken from you by the Power Siting Board. That's why I feel strongly the only equitable way to site wind turbine projects is by measuring the appropriate safety perimeters from the property line. Then both farmers, in this case, can preserve the full development rights of their property. That seems fair and reasonable to me. People say, I have the right to do what I like on my own property, but Oliver Wendell Holmes said the right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. My corollary to that says if my development project requires me to repeatedly punch you in the nose, I should first get your consent and then compensate you for your broken nose. In my township, we adopted 4 times the height of the turbine for a property line setback, a quarter mile to participating residents with the larger setback reducible to waiver, which is kind of a key to my approach to equitable wind energy zoning. Very large setbacks to non-participating property lines, small ones to participants, but the large ones can be reduced if the developer can negotiate a waiver. If you make the setbacks large enough, it will compel them to negotiate with everybody that's going to bear the impact instead of just a small subset of the people in the community. Which is everything I just said. If you don't do it that way, you're essentially granting to some out-of-state or foreign multinational wind developer an uncompensated easement across non-participating property. The way the Power Siting Board has set this up, now that the law has changed for future projects, at least it's to the property line. But basically, you are required to donate your property to the wind developer in order to make this project feasible. And that's, again, what I've already said. So, let's get to the nuts and bolts of the noise thing. Like I say, the developer here is claiming 40 decibels at 1320. That's news to me. I've never seen that work in Michigan. I've never seen a developer claim they could reach that number at that setback. Let's ask the World Health Organization. They're pretty credible. I don't think they're anti-wind. They suggest that the health effects are minimal until you get above 40 decibels for an average nighttime noise limit. Some people on the margins of health could have some subtle effects in the 30 to 40 range. When you get to the 40 to 55 decibel nighttime noise range, now keep in mind, wind is generated sharply inverse to demand, and all the noise studies I've seen in Michigan show that their maximum output usually comes between midnight and 4 a.m. So if you're a casual wind tourist and you stopped in Paulding County at noon on a sunny August day and listened, you didn't hear them behaving their worst at all. Between 40 and 55, WHO says you start to have adverse health effects, and above 55, you're starting to see a lot of impacts. That's World Health Organization. How about the American Wind Energy Association noise expert, Bob McCunney? Now, he authored a paper that said 45 decibel outside home would not cause adverse health effects. However, later he was in a seminar where he made it very clear that if it was his home in the vicinity of the wind project, he would want the noise levels to be kept below 35 decibels, maybe even 40. The Hesslers are a father and son team of acoustic consultants. Wind developers regularly use them across the Midwest, but Minnesota hired them for a paper to study the impacts on noise in their community. And they said, look, it would be advisable for any new project to attempt to maintain a mean sound level of 40 decibels or less. They said even at 40, it doesn't mean the project would be completely insignificant with the noise spectrum, but in most cases, it would be pretty safe. I would say between 35 and 40 decibels is a pretty safe noise limit measured at the property line. It's my understanding that that's a physical setback of somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 feet. Rob Rand, an independent noise consultant, looked at our township's recommendation of 45, and they said, look, these noise levels in New England have been associated with widespread complaints, appeals to stop the noise, and legal action. Now, Vestas also says in quiet rural communities like here, there should be a low absolute maximum in areas of very low background noise, and which ensures minimal noise disturbance for turbine neighbors also in these places. I won't get into the technical details of noise. We adopted a 40 decibel nighttime noise limit. During the day, we let it go to 45. It was a compromise. We also had low frequency noise protection of 55 dBc. I think they were a reasonable compromise. In the end, the wind developers did not want to buy enough people into the project to make it fly. Now, decommissioning, it turns out, really does matter. This isn't Hawaii. I've heard wind developers make a lot of claims about decommissioning. One is they're really cheap to dispose of. I heard a guy say you can just loosen the bolts at the base, stack dynamite against one side, and you drop them like a tree. Honestly, they've also said that the scrap value easily pays for the decommissioning cost. Well, if the scrap value did that, why are they still standing in Hawaii rusting to pieces? If the scrap value was adequate, they wouldn't be there. But we have another credible source on the expected lifespan of wind turbines. Detroit Edison is one of our monopoly utilities in Michigan, and their submittals about the Gratiot wind plant said, I would expect nearly all of the tubular steel towers in the Gratiot wind park to be in service for at least 20 years. We're not even talking the moving parts. They're suggesting that most of the tubular steel towers themselves would still be serviceable after 20 years. They said the gearboxes will be shot every 10, the rotors will be shot every 20, the nacelle will be shot at 25. Now, people who sign a 60-year wind lease may think that at the end of the lifespan of the first turbine, they'll come in on the same base and build another one in the same place. Except what we've seen is in Michigan, the first turbines built 7 years ago were 390 foot. Now they're 494. The next ones will be 570 or 590. What's that mean? Your old turbine base, if they're still building wind 20 years from now, is going to sit there and they're over 150 feet and build another one. And maybe 20 years from now, they might do another one next to that. It's hard to know. I just read an article online that showed they're talking about spiral welders so they can build much larger turbine bases yet. You'll see 700, 800, 900 footers if you can let them get away with it. I recommend the communities have a decommissioning bond paid for by the wind developer. They often want to recommend a financial guarantee. That's not recommended. Here's why. The majority of the earlier economics of wind projects are derived from tax benefits. This is from next era stuff. See, most of the benefit comes from tax, like Tom was saying. Since the bulk of a wind project's economic value in the early years is from tax avoidance, most projects change hands after the initial 5 to 7 years. The entity you are dealing with today in your community is almost certainly not going to be the entity that owns the project 7 years from now or 10 years from now. Frankly, we don't really know what happens to a project after the end of the production tax credit and the gearboxes are worn out. I'm not sure who comes in. Does the LLC just go bankrupt and say, sorry about your luck? We just don't know. They haven't made it that long. NextEra had a 15-year-old wind project in Texas, and the turbines were worn out and they just tore them down. They didn't replace them. It was no longer cost effective to update them. Like I said, our oldest project in Michigan is on its third owner. Property values. Independent property value reports everywhere from the London School of Economics to McCann Appraisal, Lansing, all show significant property value losses less than 2 miles from the turbine. Now, of course, the wind guys will bring the famous Holman study, and they'll say, well, no statistically significant loss of property value is what they're suggesting. Curiously, Mr. Holman was caught in a radio interview or telephone interview with a guy, and he says, you know, we are very cautious about what happens close to the turbines. We don't really know what's going on there roughly 1,250 feet from the home. Well, it sounds to me like that's the distance they're talking about here. You might know about a property value guarantee. It's dicey and complicated. I think homes that are very close, there's just too much unknown right now. I think one of the things, and I saw this in the newspaper article too, it happens everywhere. There's only one playbook for wind development, and they all have a copy. One of the things that often happens is they put our report forward and say, look, property values aren't affected. And that's not what we would say specifically. On the other hand, they have little ground to stand on if they say they won't guarantee it. So what do I recommend then in general terms for effective and safe wind energy zoning? Most land use changes are pretty benign. Lot sizes, sign ordinances, etc. I mean, if your billboard says it can be 100 square feet, you move it to 120. Some people won't like it, but it's not going to drive anybody from their home. But wind turbine impacts are really significant. Riga felt that the change of land use policy was so massive and so profound that it could not occur without consent and compensation to all parties. Two-stage setbacks with a waiver option for noise and distance required the developer to negotiate with everybody. It is fair and equitable and prevents community division. And remember, nobody's ever come into the power siting board and said, you know, the light coming through my windows is too steady, could you make it flicker? The nighttime noise level is too quiet, could you raise it to 55 from 25? My property values are too stable. Could you build some 50-story industrial machines next door to put that value at risk? When you're dealing with wind developers, you have to keep a couple things in mind. Any developers, honestly. They will never have the right answer to the questions of health, safety, and welfare when their paycheck depends on not knowing the right answer to questions of health, safety, and welfare. And secondly, when it comes to their expert, he that pays the fiddler gets to pick the tune. There are only two types of wind regulations. Those that award your property to a wind developer as a free, uncompensated nuisance and safety easement. I think reasonable wind siting would demand that those easements be negotiated individually and privately between the developer and the impacted landowners, all of them, rather than forced upon them by zoning or siting regulation. Who decides? The wind developer often wants a siting board to give them your property for free. We think that those decisions should be made privately by strong regulation that forces everybody to name their own price. And here's a small picture of what 390-foot class turbines look like at various setbacks in Illinois. Thank you.